Imagine your own child, cold and alone, with nowhere to turn. Now imagine that child is 9-year-old Clara, abandoned under a bridge on the coldest night of winter. It's December 1973. Clara sits on frozen ground covered in snow, clutching her teddy bear. Her parents left her here with nothing but the clothes on her back. The wind howls as cars pass overhead, but nobody stops. Clara lights a small candle she found earlier. In the flickering light, she sees footprints in the snow leading toward her. Then a woman appears, wearing blue and white robes. She has the kindest face Clara has ever seen. Without saying a word, the woman kneels down beside her in the snow. Clara believes it's the Virgin Mary. But what really happened under that bridge? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months before that terrible December night, Clara Martinez lived in a cramped apartment on Detroit's South Side, where hope grew thinner with each passing day. The autumn leaves had fallen from the skeletal trees lining Corktown Street, and winter's first cruel hints seeped through cracked windows of their third-floor home. Clara's world revolved around small comforts: her worn teddy bear from grandmother, morning sunlight through the kitchen window, and stories her mother Rosa once told about angels watching over good children. But those stories had grown rare as Rosa's smiles, replaced by long silences and the sharp smell of whiskey that followed Clara's father like a shadow. Miguel Martinez had once been proud. His calloused hands told 20 years at the Ford River. Rouge plant, working assembly lines with steady determination. Clara remembered riding his shoulders to the corner market, his deep voice humming Mexican songs while neighbors nodded respect. "Mijo works hard," they'd tell Rosa. "You have a good man." But good men sometimes break under invisible pressure. The layoffs came in September, swift as Detroit winter. One day, Miguel left whistling with his metal lunchbox. The next, he returned. Before noon, with empty hands and hollow eyes. The pink slip might as well have been a death certificate for the father Clara knew. "It's temporary," Rosa whispered that first night, smoothing Clara's dark hair, while Miguel sat silent at the kitchen table, staring at unpayable bills. "Papa will find something new." But temporary stretched into months. Unemployment checks, barely. Covered rent. Miguel's applications returned with polite rejections or silence. 47 years old, in a city full of younger men willing to work for less, he began understanding his usefulness had expired. That's when whiskey started talking louder than hope. Clara noticed changes in small ways. Father stopped humming, stopped asking about school, stopped helping with homework at their kitchen table. The man who once carried her on his shoulders now looked right through her, as if she were glass. Rosa fought to hold their family together with fierce determination. She took extra shifts cleaning downtown offices, leaving before dawn, returning after dark with bleach-raw hands and exhaustion etched in every line. But scrubbing other people's floors couldn't wash away their growing desperation. "We'll be okay." "Mija," Rosa whispered when Clara asked why Mama looked so tired. "God provides for those who work hard." Clara wanted to believe, but God seemed far from their drafty apartment where heat had been shut off twice and the refrigerator hummed with dangerous emptiness. Being 9 didn't protect her from seeing truths adults tried hiding. At St. Augustine Elementary, Sister Margaret noticed changes too. The bright girl, who eagerly raised her hand, began sitting quietly in back. Her pressed uniform became wrinkled, homework incomplete. When Sister Margaret kept her after class one afternoon, Clara's stomach growled so loudly, the nun quietly handed her crackers from her desk drawer. "Are you eating enough at home, Clara?" Sister Margaret asked gently. Clara nodded quickly, not trusting her voice to lie convincingly. She'd learned that telling adults home truths sometimes made things worse. Sister Margaret was wise in ways only teachers who've seen generations of struggling children can be. She began keeping extra snacks, and Clara learned to linger after school for packages of cookies or apples, with questions asking smiles. During these visits, Clara first learned about the Virgin Mary. While other children hurried home to warm dinners, Clara would slip into the small chapel and kneel before Our Lady of Guadalupe's statue. Sister Margaret told her the story, how the Virgin appeared to a poor man, bringing comfort and hope to those with neither. Clara would stare at that painted face, so serene and beautiful, whispering learned prayers. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. The words felt heavy with meaning she didn't understand, but offered what home no longer provided: peace. In her coat pocket, she kept her mother's old rosary, wooden beads worn smooth by generations of worried fingers. Rosa had given it last Christmas, when they still had money for presents and reasons to celebrate. Now several beads were missing, the silver crucifix tarnished, but Clara treasured this connection to better times and faith that maybe those times could return. At home, silence between her parents grew thicker daily. Miguel would sit by the window, drinking beer when they had money, whiskey when Rosa's jobs provided enough for cheap bottles. Rosa moved through their rooms like a ghost, washing dishes twice, folding and refolding Clara's clothes, staying busy. To avoid the conversation they all knew was coming, Clara developed skills children of struggling families learn too young, making herself small and invisible. She did homework on her bedroom floor, speaking only when spoken to, pretending sleep when angry voices rose through thin walls late at night. She became expert at reading her parents' mood temperatures, learning when to ask for help and when to handle things alone. The worst part wasn't hunger or cold. It was watching her parents disappear bit by bit. Rosa's musical laughter became memory. Miguel's gentle strength transformed into something brittle that might break any moment. They still lived in the same space, but Clara felt more alone than ever. November brought first snow and their first real crisis. Landlord Mr. Kowalski knocked Tuesday evening with eyes holding no sympathy for sob stories he'd heard too often. 2 months behind Miguel, he said without unkindness, but no negotiation room. I got a family wants the place. You got until Christmas to catch up or get out. Clara peeked around the corner, saw her father's shoulders shake, not from cold, but from something breaking inside that had been cracking for months. Rosa put her hand on his arm, but he pulled away, walking to the window to stare at falling snow like judgment from heaven. That night, Clara heard them talking in voices tight with desperation. Numbers were mentioned, amounts that might as well have been millions. She heard her mother crying, a sound more terrible than nightmares, and her father's voice rough with whiskey and defeat. There's got to be another way, Rosa pleaded. What way? Miguel's voice cracked. I'm 47 with no job, no prospects, nothing. We can't even feed her proper. Look at her, Rosa. Look at what we're doing to our baby. Clara squeezed her. Teddy bear, trying not to listen, but walls have ears when you're small and scared and need to know if your world is ending. She heard words that would haunt her. Temporary, better off, people who can take care of her. She didn't understand what they were planning. 9-year-old minds don't grasp desperate mathematics of adults, seeing only impossible choices ahead. She only knew something terrible was growing in their home like cancer, and no prayers to the Virgin Mary seemed able to stop it. December arrived with vengeance, bringing temperatures that turned their inadequately heated apartment into an icebox. Clara's breath misted when she woke mornings, and she learned sleeping in all her clothes. At school, Sister Margaret kept her longer after classes, not just for snacks, but for warmth of a building with actual heat. Would you like to help me? I'd clean the chapel today, she'd ask, and Clara would nod gratefully. Together they'd dust pews and polish brass candlesticks, while Sister Margaret told stories of saints who endured hardships and found grace beyond suffering. Clara clung to these stories like lifelines. St. Bernadette, who saw Virgin Mary visions at Lourdes. St. Joan, who heard angel voices. St. Therese, who found God in small love acts during great suffering. These women had been young too, Sister Margaret explained, but found strength, because they knew they were never truly alone. God watches over those with pure hearts, Clara, the old nun would say. Sometimes help comes in ways we don't expect. Clara tucked these words into her heart with her prayers, not knowing how prophetic they'd prove. December 21st arrived like a funeral shroud over Detroit. The shortest day of the year brought news that would shatter what remained of the Martinez family, their final eviction notice. Mr. Kowalski stood in their doorway one last time, his face etched with reluctant sympathy. "I'm sorry, Miguel, I really am, but I got bills too, and the new tenants move in tomorrow." Clara watched from behind her bedroom door as her father's last thread of dignity snapped. Miguel didn't argue or plead. He simply nodded and closed the door with the quiet finality of a man accepting his execution. That night, while Clara pretended to sleep, her parents held the conversation that would change everything. Their voices carried through thin walls like smoke, impossible to ignore. "We can't live in the car with her, Miguel. Not in this weather. I know that." His voice was hollow, defeated. "But what choice do we have? There's the shelter. The shelter's full. I called yesterday. They got a waiting list longer than my arm." Clara pressed her ear against the cold wall, her teddy bear clutched tight against her chest. In her coat pocket she felt the familiar weight of her mother's broken rosary. Its missing beads like gaps in a prayer that couldn't be completed. "What about your sister in Toledo?" Rosa whispered. "She's got her own problems. Besides, she made it clear last time." "Then what?" Rosa's voice broke. "Tell me what we're supposed to do." The silence stretched so long Clara thought they'd gone to bed. Then Miguel spoke words that would echo in her nightmares for years to come. "Maybe it's time we thought about Clara's future. Real hard." "What do you mean?" "I mean maybe the best thing we can do for her is let someone else take care of her. Someone who can give her what she needs." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She understood enough to know they were talking about giving her away, like the puppies Mrs. Henderson had to find new homes for when her dog had too many babies. "Miguel, no. She's our daughter. And look what we're doing to her." His voice rose, then dropped to an urgent whisper. "She's hungry, Rosa. Our baby is hungry, and we can't even keep her warm. What kind of parents are we?" Clara heard her mother crying, soft, broken sobs that cut through the darkness like knives. "There's got to be another way," Rosa pleaded. "What way? Tell me what way, because I can't see one." But Clara could hear in his voice that Miguel had already made his decision. In the mathematics of desperation, adults sometimes convince themselves that terrible choices are actually acts of love. The next morning, Clara woke to unusual activity. Her parents moved through their apartment with the mechanical efficiency of people trying not to think about what they were doing. Rosa packed Clara's few belongings into a small suitcase: 3 dresses, underclothes, her school shoes, and the photograph of her grandmother. "Where are we going, Mama?" Clara asked. Though something cold in her stomach already knew the answer wouldn't be good. "Just for a ride, Mija. Put on your warmest coat." Clara dressed carefully, sensing the importance of the moment, even if she didn't understand it. She slipped her mother's rosary deep into her coat pocket, along with a small votive candle she'd taken from the church when Sister Margaret wasn't looking. She'd meant to return it, but somehow it felt important to keep it close. The drive through Detroit's snow-covered streets felt like traveling through a dream. Miguel's old Buick wheezed and rattled, its heater barely functional. Clara sat in the back seat, holding her teddy bear and watching familiar neighborhoods disappear behind them. Rosa kept turning around to look at her with eyes that seemed to memorize every detail of her daughter's face. "Are we going to see someone?" Clara asked, as they drove farther from anything she recognized. "Something like that," Miguel said, his voice tight. They stopped at a highway overpass on the city's outskirts, where concrete pillars supported the road above and created a sheltered space beneath. It was the kind of place Clara had seen from car windows, but never imagined visiting. A forgotten corner where homeless people sometimes gathered around trash can fires. Miguel parked and turned off the engine. In the sudden silence, Clara could hear the wind howling through the bridge supports and the distant hum of traffic overhead. "Papa?" Clara's voice was small, afraid. Miguel's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel. Rosa turned in her seat, tears streaming down her face. "Clara, baby, listen to me. Mama and Papa have to go away for a while, but we're going to make sure you're safe." "I don't understand." "Someone will come for you," Rosa said, her voice breaking. "Someone who can take better care of you than we can right now." Clara felt the world tilting beneath her. "I don't want someone else. I want you." "I know, Mia, I know. But sometimes—" Rosa couldn't finish. Miguel got out and opened Clara's door. The cold hit her like a slap, and she instinctively pulled back. "Come on, Clara," he said gently. "Just for a few minutes." Clara climbed out slowly, still holding her teddy bear. Miguel led her to a relatively sheltered spot beneath the bridge, where wind-blown snow had created a small drift against the concrete wall. He knelt down and pulled her close, and for a moment he smelled like the father she remembered, Old Spice and honest sweat instead of whiskey and desperation. "You're a good girl, Clara. The best girl in the whole world, don't you ever forget." "That okay?" Clara nodded, though she didn't understand why he was talking like they wouldn't see each other again soon. Miguel walked back to the car where Rosa waited, her face buried in her hands. Clara watched through the windshield as her parents had what looked like a final, urgent conversation. Rosa shook her head violently, but Miguel's face was set with terrible determination. The car door opened and Rosa ran to Clara, scooping her into a fierce embrace. "I love you, baby. I love you so much. Remember that no matter what happens, Mama loves you." "Mama, I'm scared." "I know. But you're brave, remember? You're the bravest little girl I know." Rosa kissed Clara's forehead, her tears warm against Clara's cold cheek. Then she pressed something into Clara's hand, a few crumpled dollar bills and a note written on the back of a receipt. "If you need help, you show someone this, okay? It has our names and information." Clara looked down at the paper, but the words blurred through her tears. Miguel appeared beside them, his face carved from stone. "We have to go, Rosa." "No." Rosa whispered. I can't leave her." "We have to." Miguel gently pulled Rosa away from Clara. Rosa fought him for a moment, reaching for her daughter, then suddenly went limp with defeat. Clara watched her parents walk back to the car. The engine coughed to life, headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. The old Buick pulled away slowly. Rosa's face pressed against the rear window, her mouth moving in words Clara couldn't hear. Then they were gone. Clara stood alone beneath the bridge, holding her teddy bear and watching the taillights disappear into traffic. Snow began to fall harder, large flakes that caught in her hair and melted on her cheeks like tears. She didn't understand what had happened, not really. 9-year-old minds aren't equipped to process abandonment in adult terms. She only knew that her world had suddenly become very large and very cold, and she was smaller than she'd ever been. Clara looked around the desolate space beneath the bridge. Concrete pillars stretched up into shadows, covered with spray-painted words she couldn't read. Empty bottles and fast food containers littered the ground, and the smell of urine and decay made her wrinkle her nose. But somewhere in her coat pocket, her fingers found the small votive candle and her mother's broken rosary, without fully understanding why. Clara felt a tiny spark of something that wasn't quite hope, but wasn't complete despair either. She was alone, but she carried with her the prayers Sister Margaret had taught her and the stories of saints who had endured impossible things. Maybe somehow that would be enough. The first hour was the longest of Clara's young life. She stood exactly where her parents had left her, convinced that if she moved even a single step, they wouldn't be able to find her when they came back. Because surely they would come back. Parents didn't just leave their children under bridges forever. This had to be some kind of mistake, a terrible misunderstanding that would be corrected once they realized what they'd done. But as traffic rumbled overhead and the snow fell steadier, Clara began to understand that waiting wasn't going to make her parents reappear. The December wind cut through her coat like it was made of paper, and her feet were already going numb inside her thin school shoes. She found a spot against the concrete wall where the wind couldn't reach quite so fiercely, and sat down, pulling her knees to her chest. Her teddy bear, worn and beloved, became her anchor to everything familiar in a world that had suddenly become strange and frightening. "It's okay, Mr. Bear," she whispered, using the name she'd given him when she was 4. "Mama and Papa will come back soon. They just had to go get help or something." But even as she spoke the words, doubt crept into her heart like cold seeping through her coat. She remembered her parents' faces in the car, her mother's tears, her father's terrible determination. Those weren't the faces of people planning to return quickly. Clara fumbled in her coat pocket and pulled out the votive candle, its white wax smooth and comforting in her small hands. Sister Margaret had taught her that candles were prayers made visible, light offered up to God and the saints who watched over children. Right now, Clara needed all the watching over she could get. But she had no matches, no way to light the candle that represented her only connection to the divine. She held it anyway, feeling its solid weight, remembering the warm glow of the chapel candles when she and Sister Margaret cleaned the church together. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," Clara began, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I don't know if you can hear me from here, but I'm scared. My mama and papa left me, and I don't know why. I don't know what I did wrong." The words tumbled out, part prayer, part conversation with the teddy bear, part desperate plea to anyone who might be listening. Clara told the Virgin Mary about the cold seeping through her clothes, about the strange smells under the bridge, about how her stomach felt hollow and her heart felt even emptier. As darkness began to fall, Clara's situation grew more desperate. The temperature was dropping fast, and she could see her breath misting in the frigid air. Her fingers were so cold she could barely feel them, and her feet had progressed from numb to completely without sensation. She tried to remember everything Sister Margaret had taught her about saints who had suffered. Saint Sebastian, shot full of arrows but surviving through faith. St. Lawrence, who joked with his executioners even while being burned alive. These holy people had endured impossible pain because they knew God was with them, even in their darkest moments. "Maybe this is my test," Clara whispered to her teddy bear. "Maybe I'm supposed to be brave like the saints." But she didn't feel brave. She felt small and forgotten and colder than she'd ever been in her life. When she tried to stand up, her legs were stiff and unsteady. When she tried to walk to find a warmer spot, every step sent sharp pains through her frozen feet. That's when Clara noticed something impossible. In the snow near where she'd been sitting, there were footprints. Not her small shoe prints, but larger ones. The prints of an adult walking slowly and deliberately toward the place where she huddled against the concrete wall. Clara stared at the prints, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't heard anyone approach. She hadn't seen anyone walking around the bridge, but there they were, clear as day in the fresh snow, footprints leading directly to her. She followed the trail with her eyes, trying to understand where they came from and where they led. They seemed to appear out of nowhere, about 20 feet away, as if someone had simply materialized from the falling snow and walked calmly toward her hiding spot. But the footprints didn't continue past where she sat. They simply stopped, as if whoever made them had vanished as mysteriously as they'd appeared. Clara felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. Every story Sister Margaret had ever told her about saints and miracles came flooding back. Angels walking among humans, divine messengers appearing to those in desperate need. The Virgin Mary herself, showing up to comfort the suffering and afraid. "Is someone there?" Clara called softly, her voice swallowed by the wind and the rumble of traffic overhead. No answer came, but Clara could swear she felt something change in the air around her. The bitter cold seemed less sharp somehow, the wind less cutting. It might have been her imagination, or it might have been hypothermia beginning to affect her thinking. But Clara felt a presence she couldn't explain. She pulled her mother's broken rosary from her pocket, its wooden beads still warm from her body heat. Some of the beads were missing, and the silver crucifix was tarnished black, but it still felt holy in her small hands. Rosa had told her that this rosary had belonged to Clara's great-grandmother, who had carried it all the way from Mexico when she came to America seeking a better life. She prayed on these beads every single day, Rosa had said when she gave it to Clara, and every prayer made them more powerful, more connected to God. Clara wrapped the rosary around her fingers and began the prayers Sister Margaret had taught her, stumbling over some of the words, but pushing through with the determination of a child who has nowhere else to turn. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. As she prayed, Clara kept her eyes on those mysterious footprints in the snow. They were filling in slowly as more snow fell, but they were still visible, proof that something beyond her understanding was happening in this desolate place. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. The familiar words brought comfort, even spoken through chattering teeth. Clara had said these prayers hundreds of times in the warmth and safety of St. Augustine's chapel, but they felt different here under the bridge, more urgent, more necessary, more like the lifeline they were meant to be. By the time she finished a decade of the rosary, Clara realized something wonderful and impossible. She was no longer alone under the bridge. She couldn't see anyone, couldn't hear footsteps or voices, but she could feel a presence as surely as she felt the snow falling on her face. Someone, or something, had answered her prayers and come to find her in the darkness. Clara clutched her teddy bear tighter and stared into the swirling snow, waiting to see what miracle might emerge from the storm. She appeared as quietly as snowfalls, stepping out of the swirling darkness, like a figure emerging from a dream. At first, Clara thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, the cold and fear creating visions where none existed. But as the woman drew closer, Clara could see her clearly, despite the poor light and falling snow. She was tall and graceful, moving with a serenity that seemed to push back the chaos of the storm. Her robes flowed around her in shades of blue and white that somehow remained vibrant even in the dim light beneath the bridge. Her face was kind beyond description, with eyes that held depths of compassion Clara had never seen in any human expression. The woman approached slowly, her bare feet making no sound on the snow-covered concrete. She seemed untouched by the bitter cold that had Clara shivering violently. No visible breath in the frigid air, no hurried movements to escape the wind's bite. She moved like someone existing outside the normal rules of weather and discomfort. Clara's first instinct was fear. A strange woman appearing out of nowhere in such a desolate place could mean danger. But as their eyes met, that fear melted away like snow in sunlight. This was not someone who meant harm. This was someone who had come to help. The woman knelt in the snow beside Clara, her movements fluid and deliberate. Up close, Clara could see details that defied explanation. Her skin seemed to glow with soft light, and her dark hair fell in perfect waves despite the wind. Most remarkably, she radiated warmth, not the harsh heat of a furnace, but the gentle warmth of summer sunshine. "Ah, you the Virgin Mary?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. The woman didn't answer with words, but her smile contained more reassurance than any speech could have provided. She reached out slowly, giving Clara time to pull away if she wished, and gently touched the child's frozen cheek. Her touch was impossibly warm, and Clara felt sensation return to her numb face, like blood flowing back into sleeping limbs. The woman's eyes held Clara's gaze with infinite tenderness. Without speaking, she seemed to understand everything. The abandonment, the fear, the bone-deep cold that had been threatening Clara's young life. Her presence said what words could not. You are not alone. You are not forgotten. You are precious and loved. Clara felt warmth spreading through her body, starting from where the woman's hand rested on her cheek and flowing outward like warm honey through her veins. Her violent shivering began to subside, and feeling returned to her hands and feet. The improvement was so dramatic and immediate that Clara knew she was experiencing something beyond natural explanation. The woman gestured toward Clara's coat pocket, where the votive candle rested forgotten. Clara pulled it out with trembling fingers, and the woman cupped her hands around Clara's smaller ones. Suddenly, impossibly, the candle burst into flame without matches or lighter, a warm, steady flame that didn't flicker despite the wind. The light cast dancing shadows on the concrete walls, transforming the desolate space beneath the bridge into something that felt almost sacred. In the candle's glow, the woman's face appeared even more beautiful, marked by a serenity that spoke of perfect peace. Clara stared into that gentle face and felt her terror beginning to transform into something else. Not quite hope, but a deep sense that somehow, despite everything that had happened, she was going to be all right. This mysterious woman had appeared at her darkest moment, bringing warmth and light and a presence that pushed back the despair, threatening to swallow her whole. The woman reached into the folds of her robe and withdrew something small and shimmering. She placed it in Clara's free hand, a piece of blue fabric, softer than anything Clara had ever touched. It seemed to hold warmth within its fibers, and when Clara pressed it to her face, it smelled like roses and spring rain, and all the good things she had almost forgotten existed. With this simple gesture, the woman was telling Clara something important. This encounter was real, this moment mattered, and Clara would have proof that she hadn't imagined the miracle of being found and comforted in her greatest need. The woman stood slowly and walked a few steps away, her robes flowing like water around her feet. She turned back toward Clara with an expression of such pure love that the child felt her heart swell with an emotion too big for words. Then the woman knelt again, this time in an attitude of prayer, her hands folded and her head bowed. Clara understood. This holy woman was praying for her, for a small, frightened girl who had been abandoned under a bridge on the coldest night of winter. The realization made Clara cry, but these weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of gratitude and wonder at finding herself the object of such divine attention. The woman prayed silently, but Clara could feel the power of her intercession, like warmth radiating through the cold air. Whatever words she spoke to God on Clara's behalf, they carried weight and authority that came from a source beyond human understanding. Time seemed suspended in that moment. The traffic overhead became distant and unimportant. The falling snow created a curtain around their small circle of candlelight, shutting out the harsh world and creating a space where miracles felt not only possible, but inevitable. Clara watched the woman pray and felt something fundamental shift inside herself. The despair that had been crushing her chest like a stone began to lift. The terror that had made her small body shake with more than cold started to fade. In its place grew a conviction that had no logical foundation, but felt absolutely true. She was going to survive this night. Somehow, she was going to be okay. The woman finished her prayer and looked up at Clara with eyes that seemed to hold all the tenderness in the world. She reached out once more, this time touching Clara's forehead, with fingers that felt like blessing itself. Clara felt strength flow into her. Not physical strength, though that came too, but strength of spirit that made her feel capable of enduring whatever lay ahead. Then the woman began to fade. Not all at once, but gradually, like morning mist dissipating. In sunlight, Clara could still see her clearly, but she seemed less solid somehow, as if the boundary between the earthly world and whatever realm she truly inhabited was reasserting itself. "Don't leave me," Clara whispered, sudden panic rising in her chest. The woman smiled one last time and shook her head gently. She wasn't leaving. Not really. Her presence would remain, invisibly but surely, for as long as Clara needed her. The warmth she had brought would linger. The peace she had imparted would sustain Clara through whatever trials awaited. As the mysterious figure dissolved completely into the swirling snow, Clara found herself alone again beneath the bridge. But everything had changed. The votive candle still burned steadily in her hands, its flame impossibly undimmed by wind or weather. The piece of blue fabric remained warm and soft against her palm. And most importantly, the crushing weight of abandonment and despair had been replaced by something Clara couldn't name, but knew was stronger than fear. She was still cold, still hungry, still a 9-year-old girl abandoned in a dangerous place, on the worst night of winter. But now she was also something else, a child who had been visited by the divine and found worthy of miraculous intervention. Clara held her teddy bear close and settled back against the concrete wall to wait for whatever would come next, the candlelight dancing around her like a small sun, pushing back the darkness. The hours that followed the woman's visit passed like a dream within a dream. Clara sat cradled in warmth that shouldn't have existed, holding a candle that burned without consuming itself, clutching a piece of fabric that held the essence of paradise within its threads. The impossible had become her reality, and she found herself accepting miracles as naturally as she had once accepted bedtime stories. Around her, the winter night raged with all the fury Detroit could muster. Wind howled through the bridge supports, with voices that sounded like lost souls crying for mercy. Snow fell so heavily it seemed like the sky was emptying itself of every flake it had ever held. The temperature dropped to levels that should have been fatal for a small child with inadequate shelter, but Clara felt none of it. The warmth that had flowed into her when the mysterious woman touched her cheek continued to sustain her, creating an invisible cocoon of comfort that held the killing cold at bay. Her fingers remained nimble and responsive. Her feet stayed warm inside her thin shoes. Her breathing remained steady and unlabored, showing none of the signs of hypothermia that should have claimed her within hours. She talked to her teddy bear, in whispers, sharing her wonder at what had happened. "Did you see her, Mr. Bear? Did you see how beautiful she was?" Clara stroked the worn fur of her faithful companion. "Sister Margaret was right about the Virgin Mary. She really does watch over children who need help." The teddy bear's button eyes seemed to reflect the candlelight with an intelligence of their own, as if he too had been touched by the presence that had transformed this desolate place into something sacred. Clara pulled her mother's broken rosary from her coat pocket and began to pray with newfound purpose. Each word carried weight now. Each Hail Mary felt like a letter being delivered directly to heaven. The missing beads no longer seemed like damage, but like spaces where her faith could flow freely, unrestrained by physical boundaries. "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." As she prayed, Clara began to understand things that had confused her before. Her parents hadn't abandoned her out of cruelty, but out of a desperate love that couldn't see any other way to save her. They believed, wrongly but sincerely, that leaving her might somehow lead to her rescue by people better equipped to care for her. Their hearts were breaking even as they drove away, but they thought they were choosing her welfare over their own desires. This understanding didn't make the abandonment hurt less, but it transformed the hurt from something that might destroy her into something that deepened her compassion. Even at 9 years old, Clara was learning lessons about forgiveness that most adults struggled to master. "Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus." The votive candle continued its impossible burning, its flame steady as a lighthouse beacon cutting through the storm. Clara held it carefully, knowing instinctively that this light was more than mere fire. It was hope made visible, prayer given form, divine attention focused into something she could hold in her small hands. By the candle's glow, she examined the piece of blue fabric the woman had given her. It was unlike any material Clara had ever seen, seeming to shimmer with its own inner light. When she pressed it to her face, warmth flowed into her like sunlight, and the scent of roses filled her nostrils so strongly she could almost see the garden where such flowers might grow. But it was more than just beautiful cloth. As Clara held it, she began to receive what she could only describe as messages, not words exactly, but impressions that formed in her mind with crystal clarity. She saw images of other children throughout history who had been lost and afraid, all of them visited by the same mysterious woman who had come to her. She understood that she was part of a long tradition of divine intervention, connected to saints and mystics and ordinary people who had encountered the extraordinary in their darkest moments. The fabric seemed to contain memories of comfort given across centuries, to a shepherd boy in ancient Palestine, to a young girl hiding from persecution in medieval Europe, to countless children whose names were forgotten by history but were remembered perfectly by heaven. Clara was not the first child to receive this miraculous care, and she would not be the last. Meanwhile, in another part of Detroit, Clara's parents were discovering that abandoning their daughter had not solved their problems, but had created entirely new forms of anguish. Miguel sat in their empty apartment, surrounded by eviction notices and unpaid bills, but all he could think about was Clara's face in the rearview mirror as they drove away. The whiskey that had once numbed his pain now seemed to amplify it, turning every sip into liquid regret. Rosa had not stopped crying since they returned home. She moved through their rooms like a ghost, picking up Clara's few remaining possessions, a hair ribbon forgotten in the bathroom, a crayon that had rolled under the couch, and holding them as if they were sacred relics. The practical voice in her head kept insisting they had done the right thing, the only thing possible under the circumstances. But the mother's heart in her chest knew better. "We have to go back," she told Miguel, for the 100th time. "We can't leave her there all night." "And then what?" Miguel's voice was rough with unshed tears. "Bring her back to this?" He gestured at their barren apartment, where the electricity had been shut off and the heat barely functioned. "At least, where she is, someone might find her, someone who can actually help." But even as he spoke the words, Miguel knew they sounded hollow. What they had done was rationalize the impossible, convince themselves that abandoning their child in a freezing wasteland was somehow an act of love rather than an act of desperation that crossed every line decent people were supposed to respect. Back beneath the bridge, Clara remained unaware of her parents' anguish. She was discovering something remarkable. In the presence of the divine, human understanding expanded beyond its normal limits. She found herself grasping concepts that should have been far beyond a 9-year-old's comprehension. She understood, for instance, that the woman who had visited her existed both in time and outside of it, appearing whenever and wherever desperate. Children needed comfort. She grasped that miracles were not violations of natural law, but expressions of a deeper law that governed reality at levels most people never glimpsed. She realized that her own suffering, terrible as it was, had opened doorways in her spirit that might never have opened otherwise. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. As Clara completed another decade of the rosary, she discovered something new among her possessions. Tucked into the folds of her coat was a small object she had never seen before, a miraculous medal, its silver surface gleaming despite the poor light. On one side was the image of the Virgin Mary with arms outstretched, rays of light streaming from her hands. On the other were the Sacred Heart of Jesus and the Immaculate Heart of Mary, surrounded by 12 stars. Clara had heard of such medals from Sister Margaret, who had explained their significance in the Catholic tradition. They were signs of special protection, worn by those who had been marked for divine attention. That such a thing should appear in her coat seemed like confirmation of everything she had experienced and everything she was beginning to understand. About her situation, She was no longer simply an abandoned child waiting for rescue. She had become something else entirely, a witness to the miraculous, a living testament to the truth that God had not forgotten the world, no matter how dark and cold it sometimes seemed. As the night deepened toward its darkest hours, Clara experienced something that would have seemed impossible just hours before. She began to feel joy, not happiness. The circumstances of her abandonment remained heartbreaking, but a profound joy that seemed to spring from a source deeper than circumstance, older than pain. It started when she discovered the small children's prayer book that had somehow appeared beside her in the snow. Like the miraculous medal, it materialized without explanation, as if the very air had condensed into something useful for her spiritual journey. The book was small enough to fit in her palm, bound in soft leather that felt warm to the touch. Despite the frigid air, Clara opened it carefully, afraid it might disappear as mysteriously as it had arrived. Inside, she found prayers written in simple language that spoke directly to her heart. These weren't the complex Latin phrases she sometimes heard at Mass, but gentle words that felt like conversations with a beloved friend. "Dear Jesus," read. The first prayer, "Thank you for watching over me when I am scared. Help me remember that I am never truly alone because you are always with me." Clara read the words aloud, her breath visible in small puffs that caught the candlelight like tiny clouds. As she spoke each phrase, she felt the truth of it settling into her bones. She was afraid, of course she was, but underneath the fear lay something unshakable, the certainty that she was being held by love, too vast for her young mind to fully comprehend. She turned the page and found a prayer for parents. "Dear Mary, please bless my mother and father. Help them make good choices and keep them safe from harm. Show them how much you love them, even when they make mistakes." Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks as she read these words, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of understanding, of compassion that surprised her with its maturity. As she sat beneath that bridge, warmed by impossible heat and lit by miraculous flame, Clara found herself truly forgiving her parents for the first time since they'd driven away. She could see them now in her mind's eye, not as the people who had abandoned her, but as two frightened adults who had convinced themselves that abandoning her was somehow an act of love. They were suffering too, she realized, maybe even more than she was, because they had chosen to cause the pain rather than simply endure it. "I forgive you, Mama," Clara whispered to the snowy air. "I forgive you, Papa. I know you thought you were helping me." The moment those words left her lips, Clara felt something shift in the spiritual atmosphere around her. The air seemed to shimmer with approval, and she sensed that her forgiveness had traveled somehow across the miles to touch her parents' hearts, offering them comfort they didn't know they needed. Meanwhile, Detective Ray Thompson was beginning what would become the most important investigation of his 20-year career, though he didn't know it yet. A call had come in around midnight. A trucker passing under the overpass thought he'd seen a small figure moving near the bridge supports. Most cops might have dismissed it as a vagrant or someone's imagination, but Thompson had learned to pay attention to the details others overlooked. He'd been working Detroit's streets long enough to know that the city's forgotten corners often held its most vulnerable residents. Children sleeping in abandoned buildings, elderly homeless people freezing in doorways, families living in cars because shelters were full. Thompson had seen it all, and each case had carved away a piece of his cynicism, replacing it with something harder to define but more useful: hope. "Probably nothing," his partner Jenkins had said when the call came through. "Just some drunk seeing things." But Thompson insisted on checking it out. Something about the caller's voice, the concern, the certainty that he'd seen something small and alone had triggered Thompson's instincts. In 20 years of police work, he'd learned to trust those instincts above all else. Back beneath the bridge, Clara continued her journey through the small prayer book, each page revealing new treasures. She found a prayer for protection that seemed written specifically for children in danger. Guardian angel, my dear friend, stay close beside me till the end. Keep me safe from harm this night. Surround me with your holy light." As she spoke these words, Clara became aware of something remarkable. She was no longer cold at all. The bitter December wind still howled around the bridge supports. Snow still fell in thick curtains, but she sat in a bubble of perfect warmth that made her feel as protected as if she were wrapped in her grandmother's quilt back home. The votive candle continued its impossible burning, its flame growing brighter as the night grew darker. By its light, Clara could see details of the bridge structure she hadn't noticed before. Someone, long ago by the look of it, had painted a small cross on one of the concrete pillars. Weather and time had faded it almost to invisibility, but in the miraculous candlelight it seemed to glow with renewed significance. Clara understood instinctively that she wasn't the first person to seek shelter in this place. Others had been here before her, lost souls, desperate people, children like herself who had found themselves with nowhere else to turn. The faded cross was evidence that someone, at some point, had found reason for faith even in this desolate spot. She pressed the piece of blue fabric to her heart and felt a surge of connection to all those who had suffered and been comforted, who had despaired and been visited by hope. The fabric seemed to contain their stories, their prayers, their moments of divine encounter. Clara was part of an ancient tradition she was only beginning to understand. As the hours passed, Clara found herself changing in ways she couldn't articulate. The frightened, abandoned child who had been left under the bridge was still there, but she was being joined by someone new, someone wise beyond her years, someone who had looked into the face of the divine and been transformed by the experience. She thought about Sister Margaret's stories of young saints who had received visions and messages from heaven. Saint Bernadette, who saw the Virgin Mary at Lourdes when she was just 14. Saint Juan Diego, who encountered Our Lady of Guadalupe and carried her message to the world. These were ordinary people, humble people who had been chosen for extraordinary purpose. Was that what was happening to her, Clara wondered? Was she being prepared for something beyond her current understanding? The prayer book seemed to answer her question. On its last page, she found words that felt like a commission, a calling to something greater than survival. "Dear child of God, you are precious beyond measure. Your prayers have power. Your faith can move mountains. Your love can heal the world. Go forward with courage, knowing that heaven walks beside you always." Clara closed the book and held it against her chest, feeling its truth resonate in every cell of her body. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance waiting for rescue. She had become an instrument of grace, a living reminder that miracles were possible, that divine love could penetrate even the darkest corners of human experience. The night was reaching its deepest point, the hours when hope burns lowest and despair whispers loudest. But Clara sat in her circle of impossible warmth, surrounded by gifts from heaven, filled with forgiveness for those who had hurt her, and blazing with joy that had no earthly explanation. She was ready for whatever would come next. Dawn was still hours away when Detective Thompson's flashlight beam found Clara beneath the bridge. But what he discovered defied every expectation he'd formed during his drive to the overpass. He'd prepared himself to find a corpse. No child could survive a night like this without shelter, or at best, a barely conscious victim in the final stages of hypothermia. Instead, his light revealed a small girl sitting peacefully in the snow, holding a stuffed animal and what appeared to be a burning candle. She looked up at him with clear, alert eyes that showed no signs of distress or confusion. Most remarkably, she appeared completely unaffected by the brutal cold that had Thompson's teeth chattering within minutes of leaving his heated patrol car. "Hello, sweetheart," Thompson said gently, approaching slowly so as not to frighten her. "I'm Detective Thompson. What's your name?" "Clara Martinez," she replied in a steady voice. "I've been waiting for someone to find me." Thompson knelt beside her, his trained eye cataloguing details that made no sense. The child's cheeks were rosy, with health, not blue with frostbite. Her breathing was normal, not the shallow gasps of hypothermia. She clutched several objects: the teddy bear, the burning candle, what looked like a piece of fabric and a small book, but showed none of the confusion or delirium he'd expect from a child in shock. "How long have you been here, Clara?" Thompson asked, already calling for an ambulance on his radio while trying to wrap his coat around her. "Since my parents left me," Clara said simply. "But I wasn't alone. The lady in blue came to see me." Thompson felt his heart sink. Hallucinations were common in hypothermia cases, especially in children. The lady in blue was probably Clara's mind trying to cope with abandonment and life-threatening cold. Still, he had to get her to a hospital immediately. But as Thompson tried to help Clara to her feet, he made a discovery that stopped him cold. The snow around Clara showed clear evidence of recent activity, not just her small footprints, but larger ones as well. Adult footprints that seemed to circle her position, then lead away into the darkness before disappearing entirely. More troubling still, the area immediately around Clara appeared to have been protected from the worst of the storm. Snow had fallen, everywhere else in deep, even drifts, but in the space where Clara sat, the accumulation was minimal, as if something had sheltered her from the weather. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Paramedics prepared for the worst-case scenario Thompson had described over the radio. But like Thompson, they found themselves staring in confusion at a child who showed no signs of cold exposure, despite spending hours in sub-zero temperatures with inadequate clothing. "This is impossible," muttered paramedic Sarah Chen as she checked Clara's vital signs. "Her body temperature is normal, blood pressure normal, she's not even shivering." "The candle," Clara said, holding up the votive that still burned steadily. "The lady gave it to me to stay warm." Chen and her partner exchanged glances. They'd been working Detroit streets for years, had seen exposure cases that would haunt them forever. Children found frozen to death in abandoned buildings, homeless people who lost fingers and toes to frostbite, victims of hypothermia who survived but suffered permanent damage. Never had they encountered someone who spent hours in killing cold and emerged completely unharmed. At Detroit Medical Center, Clara became the subject of intense medical curiosity. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, head of emergency pediatrics, conducted examination after examination, looking for some explanation for the child's impossible condition. According to the Weather Service, temperatures reached 15 below zero last night, with wind chills of 30 below, Dr. Morrison told the assembled medical staff. This child claims she was outside for over 6 hours with minimal clothing and shelter. She should be dead. Instead, Clara sat up in her hospital bed, chatting cheerfully with nurses and asking when she could go home. Her only concern seemed to be keeping her mysterious possessions close. The teddy bear, the piece of blue fabric, the prayer book, and most puzzling of all, a miraculous medal that none of the adults could remember seeing when she arrived. It was during the routine cataloguing of Clara's belongings that the first truly inexplicable discovery was made. Nurse Patricia Williams, a 20-year veteran of the hospital, was documenting the objects Clara had brought with her when she noticed something extraordinary about the miraculous medal. "Dr. Morrison," Williams called urgently, "you need to see this." The medal bore an inscription on its reverse side, not the usual Catholic prayers or saint names, but something that made Williams' blood run cold. Maria Santos, RN, Detroit Medical Center, 1962-1968. Dr. Morrison stared at the inscription, her face pale. "That's impossible. Maria Santos died 5 years ago." But it was more than just the name that shocked the medical staff. Maria Santos had been a legend at Detroit Medical Center, a nurse whose compassion for abandoned and abused children had made her beloved by colleagues and patients alike. She died in 1968, not from disease or accident, but while trying to rescue children from a fire at St. Mary's Orphanage. The official records told a heroic story. When fire broke out in the orphanage dormitory at 3 in the morning, Maria, Santos had been the first responder. She'd made trip after trip into the burning building, carrying sleeping children to safety. On her final journey into the flames, she'd gone back for 2 infants who'd been missed in the initial evacuation. She'd saved them both, but died from smoke inhalation, her body found protecting the babies with her own. The children survived. Maria Santos became a saint in the memories of everyone who'd known her. "How does this child have Maria's medal?" Dr. Morrison whispered. "And why does she keep talking about a lady in blue who helped her?" The mystery deepened when hospital records showed that Maria Santos had indeed worn a miraculous medal, exactly like the one Clara possessed. It had been buried with her, according to the funeral home records. The idea that it could somehow have appeared in the hands of a child who'd never been to the hospital before seemed to violate every rational explanation. But Clara had more to reveal. When Dr. Morrison sat down to talk with her about her night under the bridge, the child began describing her mysterious visitor with details that made the doctor's hands tremble. "She had the kindest face," Clara said, "and she wasn't cold or even in the snow. She knelt down beside me and made me warm just by touching my cheek. She had dark hair like my mama's, but it was all perfect, even in the wind." "What did she look like, honey? Can you tell me more?" Clara's description was precise and vivid, a tall woman in her 30s, with olive skin and gentle hands. "She'd worn some kind of uniform under her blue and white robes," Clara said, "and she'd moved like someone who spent her life taking care of people." Dr. Morrison excused herself and returned with an old photograph from the hospital's archive. A group picture of the nursing staff from 1967. Without hesitation, Clara pointed to one face in the crowd. "That's her," Clara said with absolute certainty. "That's the lady who came to help me." She was pointing directly at Maria Santos. The hospital fell silent as the impossible became undeniable. Clara had somehow encountered the spirit of a nurse who died 5 years before Clara was even born, in a place Maria had never worked, carrying a medal that should have been buried with its owner. Whatever had happened under that bridge, it was more than a simple case of child abandonment and miraculous survival. Clara had become the center of something that challenged everything the medical professionals thought they knew about life, death, and the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. News of Clara's impossible survival spread through Detroit Medical Center like wildfire, drawing attention from hospital staff who remembered Maria Santos and clergy who recognized the signs of something beyond medical explanation. By afternoon, Clara's room had become an unofficial pilgrimage site, with nurses, doctors, and chaplains finding excuses to visit the small girl who claimed to have been comforted by a ghost. But it was Clara's drawing that transformed skepticism into wonder and fear into reverence. Dr. Morrison had given Clara paper and crayons, thinking art therapy might help her process the trauma of abandonment. Instead, Clara created something that left the medical staff speechless. With the careful attention to detail that only children possess, she drew the scene under the bridge. But her artwork contained information she couldn't possibly have known. The drawing showed Maria Santos in perfect detail, wearing the exact uniform the hospital had used in the 1960s, complete with the specific style of nursing cap that had been discontinued years before Clara was born. Most remarkably, Clara had drawn Maria's badge number, 2847, which matched the hospital's employment records exactly. "How could she know that?" whispered Patricia Williams, staring at the drawing with tears in her eyes. "I worked with Maria for 3 years, and I barely remembered her badge number until I looked it up. But Clara's artistic revelation went deeper. She had drawn Maria's hands in the precise position the nurse had been found in after the orphanage fire, arms curved, protectively around the children she died saving. She had captured the small scar on Maria's left wrist, the result of a childhood accident that only Maria's closest friends had known about. Most unsettling of all, Clara had drawn herself not as she appeared now, a healthy, well-cared-for child, but As she must have looked that night, thin from months of inadequate nutrition, her clothes worn and patched, her face gaunt with the stress of watching her family disintegrate. The contrast between the radiant Maria and the desperate Clara created a visual narrative of divine compassion reaching across death to comfort the living. Hospital chaplain, Father Michael O'Brien, studied the drawing with the trained eye of someone who had investigated claimed miracles for the Archdiocese of Detroit. He'd seen plenty of alleged supernatural encounters over his 30 years of ministry, and most had rational explanations once properly examined. But Clara's case defied every reasonable attempt at debunking. The details are too accurate, he told Dr. Morrison privately. Either this child has access to information about Maria Santos that should be impossible for her to obtain, or she's telling the truth about encountering her spirit. Word of Clara's experience had reached Detective Thompson's ears, and he returned to the hospital with news that complicated the story further. His investigation of the bridge site had revealed evidence that supported Clara's account in ways that made experienced investigators uncomfortable. The footprints are real, Thompson reported to the assembled medical staff. Large adult prints, size 7 women's shoes, circling the area where we found Clara. They appear suddenly in the snow about 20 feet from her location and disappear just as suddenly. No trail leading to or from the site. More disturbing still, Thompson had discovered records showing that Maria Santos had once volunteered at a homeless shelter that operated near the bridge where Clara was found. During the harsh winter of 1967, Maria had been part of a team that checked under bridges and in abandoned buildings, looking for people who might freeze to death without intervention. She knew that location, Thompson continued. She'd been there before, helping people exactly like Clara. The implications were staggering. Had Maria Santos somehow been drawn back to a place where she'd once served the desperate, called by the need of a child whose circumstances mirrored those she'd devoted her life to helping? Meanwhile, Clara's parents had finally succumbed to guilt and conscience. Miguel's drinking had accelerated after abandoning Clara, but instead of numbing his pain, the alcohol seemed to amplify his anguish until it became unbearable. Rosa had spent the night walking Detroit streets, retracing their route to the bridge, before finally calling the police to report what they'd done. When Detective Thompson found them in their empty apartment, both parents were in states of emotional collapse that went far beyond normal guilt or regret. They spoke of dreams and visions that had tormented them through the night, images of Clara calling for them, of a woman in white standing beside her, of light shining in impossible darkness. We kept seeing her, Rosa sobbed to Thompson. Over and over, we saw Clara under that bridge, but she wasn't alone. There was someone with her, someone taking care of her. Miguel's account matched his wife's in every detail, despite the fact that they'd been separated for most of the night. He drinking alone at home, while Rosa wandered the streets in anguish. Both described the same woman, the same sense of being watched and judged by eyes that held infinite compassion and infinite sorrow. She was disappointed in us, Miguel whispered. Not angry, disappointed, like we'd failed someone who loved us anyway. Thompson arranged for the parents to be brought to the hospital, knowing that Clara would need to face them eventually, and that their reunion would be crucial to her healing, both physical and spiritual. But he also knew that this meeting would likely determine whether Clara's story remained a private miracle or became something larger, something that might challenge how people understood the boundaries between life and death. At the hospital, preparation for the reunion took on the solemnity of a sacred ritual. Father O'Brien suggested that the meeting take place in the hospital chapel rather than Clara's room, sensing that the spiritual dimension of recent events required appropriate setting. Dr. Morrison agreed, understanding that whatever happened next would likely determine the trajectory of Clara's recovery and perhaps the faith of everyone involved. Clara herself seemed remarkably calm about the prospect of seeing her parents again. The anger and abandonment that might have consumed another child appeared to have been transformed by her supernatural encounter into something approaching saintly forgiveness. "I'm not mad at them anymore," Clara told Dr. Morrison as they prepared for the reunion. "The lady helped me understand. Sometimes people do wrong things because they don't know what else to do. That doesn't make the things right, but it doesn't make the people all bad either." Such wisdom from a 9-year-old left the adults around her wondering if Clara's transformation was as miraculous as her survival. The frightened, abandoned child they'd found under the bridge seemed to be evolving into someone older, wiser, marked by an encounter with the divine that had left her fundamentally changed. As afternoon faded toward evening, the key players in this impossible drama gathered in the hospital chapel, drawn together by forces none of them fully understood, but all of them felt compelled to witness. Clara sat in the front pew, still holding her teddy bear and the artifacts of her miraculous night, waiting to face the parents who had abandoned her and the miracle that had saved her. The climax of her extraordinary story was about to unfold, and everyone present sensed that what happened in the next few hours would echo far beyond the walls of Detroit Medical Center, rippling through lives and faith communities in ways they were only beginning to imagine. The hospital chapel fell silent as Miguel and Rosa Martinez entered, their faces etched with shame and disbelief at seeing their daughter alive and unharmed. They had prepared themselves to find her in critical condition, scarred by frostbite, broken by abandonment and exposure. Instead, Clara sat peacefully in the front pew, looking healthier than she had in months, her dark eyes clear and compassionate. "Clara," Rosa's voice broke on her daughter's name. "Baby, are you okay?" Clara stood slowly, still holding her teddy bear, and walked toward her parents with a grace that seemed far beyond her 9 years. There was no running, no desperate embrace, no tears of reunion. Instead, she approached them like a wise teacher coming to comfort confused students. "I'm okay, Mama," Clara said simply. "I know you thought leaving me was the only way to help me. I forgive you." The words hit Rosa like a physical blow, dropping her to her knees in the chapel aisle. She reached for Clara with trembling hands, expecting her daughter to pull away, to show some sign of the trauma and anger that should have consumed a child who'd been abandoned to die. Instead, Clara stepped into her mother's embrace with complete trust, wrapping her small arms around Rosa's neck, while Miguel stood frozen behind them, unable to process what he was witnessing. "How can you forgive us?" Rosa sobbed into Clara's hair. What we did was unforgivable. The lady told me," Clara said gently. "She helped me understand. You were scared and didn't know what else to do. That doesn't make it right, but it doesn't make you bad people either." Father O'Brien, Dr. Morrison, and Detective Thompson watched from the back of the chapel as Clara ministered to her parents with wisdom that defied explanation. The child who should have been traumatized and broken was instead offering healing to the adults whose desperation had nearly cost her life. Miguel finally found his voice, kneeling beside his wife and daughter. "Clara, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry we left you. I thought maybe someone would find you and take better care of you than we could." "Someone did find me, Papa," Clara said, pulling back to look into his eyes. "The lady in blue came to keep me warm and safe. She showed me how to forgive and how to have hope even when everything seems impossible." She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew the miraculous medal, its silver surface catching the chapel's soft lighting. "She gave me this. It belonged to her when she worked here at the hospital." Miguel stared at the medal, reading the inscription that identified it as belonging to Maria Santos. His hands shook as the implications became clear. Their daughter was claiming to have been visited and protected by someone who had died years before Clara was born. "That's impossible," Miguel whispered. "People who are dead they can't—" "She's not dead, Papa," Clara interrupted with quiet certainty. "Not really. She's just living in a different place now, and sometimes she gets to come back and help people who need her most. Dr. Morrison stepped forward from the back of the chapel. "Miguel, Rosa, I need to tell you something about that medal. Our records show that Maria Santos was buried wearing an identical medal in 1968. There's no way Clara could have obtained the original through normal means." The family photograph Clara had brought into her reunion, the one taken moments after she'd forgiven her parents and they'd collapsed into tearful embraces, captured something remarkable. While the adults in the picture showed faces marked by guilt, relief, and confusion, Clara appeared serene and luminous, as if lit from within by grace that rendered earthly circumstances secondary to spiritual truth. "I want to go home with you," Clara said, settling between her parents on the chapel pew. "But first, I need to tell you about the lady's message. She said that sometimes families have to break apart before they can come back together stronger. She said our hard time isn't over yet, but now we know we're never really alone." Rosa and Miguel exchanged glances over Clara's head, both understanding that their daughter had been transformed by her experience in ways that would take time to fully comprehend. The child who had once relied on them for everything was now offering them wisdom and strength they desperately needed. "What else did she tell you?" Rosa asked softly. Clara pulled out the small prayer book and opened it to a page near the end. "She taught me that miracles aren't just big, magical things that happen once. They're little gifts that happen every day if we know how to see them, like forgiveness and second chances, and families finding each other again even after they're lost." As Clara spoke, everyone in the chapel felt the presence of something beyond their understanding, a peace that settled over the room like warm sunlight, a sense that they were witnessing more than a family reunion, but a demonstration of divine love working through the most unlikely circumstances. The climax of Clara's story was revealing itself not as a single dramatic moment, but as a quiet transformation that would ripple outward from this chapel to touch countless lives in the years to come. The transformation that began in the chapel continued as Clara's story spread beyond the hospital walls, touching lives in ways none of them had anticipated. Within days, Detroit Medical Center found itself at the center of something that transcended medical science and entered the realm of the miraculous. Hospital staff, who had known Maria Santos, began sharing their own memories of the legendary nurse, and a pattern emerged that made Clara's encounter seem less like an isolated incident and more like the continuation of a mission that had begun decades earlier. Maria had always been drawn to the most desperate cases: abandoned children, homeless patients, families torn apart by poverty and addiction. She used to say that her job wasn't just to heal bodies, but to heal hearts, remembered Dr. Gerald Hoffman, who had worked with Maria in the pediatric ward. She'd spend her own money on clothes for children whose parents couldn't afford them. She'd stay after her shift to comfort kids who were scared and alone. The similarities between Maria's earthly ministry and her apparent intervention in Clara's life were unmistakable. She had always specialized in caring for children whom the system had failed or forgotten, and Clara's abandonment under the bridge fit perfectly with the pattern of need that had called forth Maria's compassion when she was alive. But it was the dedication ceremony for Maria's memorial plaque that truly revealed the scope of what had been set in motion by Clara's miraculous night. The hospital administration had decided to honor Maria's memory with a permanent installation in the pediatric ward. Inspired by Clara's story and the renewed awareness of Maria's legacy, Clara herself was invited to speak at the ceremony, an unprecedented honor for a child. But everyone recognized that she had become Maria's living testimony, proof that love transcends death and that divine intervention continues to operate in the world. Standing before a crowd that included hospital staff, clergy, city officials, and dozens of families whose lives had been touched by Maria during her years of service, Clara spoke with a clarity and wisdom that left her audience amazed. "Miss Maria didn't come to me because I was special," Clara said, her young voice carrying easily through the hospital atrium. She came because I needed help, and that's what she always did, help people who needed her most. She's still doing it, just in a different way now. As Clara spoke, something remarkable happened. Throughout the crowd, people began sharing their own stories of unexplained comfort during their darkest moments. A warm presence felt during a child's surgery, a sense of being watched over during medical crises, moments when hope appeared. From nowhere in hospital rooms where despair should have reigned. "She's been here all along," whispered Patricia Williams, tears streaming down her face. "Maria never really left. She's been helping people, and we just didn't realize it." Dr. Morrison stepped forward to unveil the memorial plaque, which bore Maria's photograph and a simple inscription: Maria Santos, RN, 1942-1968. Love is the bridge between two hearts, dedicated to the children she saved and the children she continues to save. But the plaque held one more surprise. Embedded in its base was a small compartment containing some of Maria's personal effects that had been discovered during the hospital's renovation: her nursing pin, her prayer book, and, remarkably, a photograph of Maria with several children at the orphanage where she'd died. Clara gasped when she saw the photograph, pointing to one of the children pictured with Maria. "That's her! That's one of the little girls Miss Maria was telling me about. She saved her from the fire." Research revealed that the child in the photograph was indeed one of the infants Maria had rescued in her final act of heroism. The woman was now in her 50s, living in California, completely unaware that her rescuer had been memorialized at Detroit Medical Center. When contacted and told about Clara's story, the woman, now a grandmother herself, broke down in tears. "I've wondered about that nurse my entire life," she said through her tears. "The nuns at the orphanage told me someone died saving me, but I never knew her name. I've been praying for her soul for 50 years. The memorial ceremony became something more profound than anyone had planned, a celebration of connections that span decades and transcend death, a recognition that acts of love create ripples that spread far beyond their immediate impact. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Clara remained beside the memorial plaque with her parents, who had been transformed as profoundly as their daughter by the experience of witnessing the miraculous. Miguel, sober for the first time in months, knelt beside the plaque and spoke, words that came from the deepest place in his heart. "Thank you for saving our daughter when we couldn't. Thank you for teaching her to forgive us when we couldn't forgive ourselves." Rosa added her own prayer. "Watch over all the children who need you, Miss Maria. Help us be better parents, better people, worthy of the miracle you gave us." Clara placed her teddy bear beside the plaque, not as an offering but as a promise. "I'll come back and visit," she told Maria's photograph, "and I'll try to help other kids the way you helped me." As the Martinez family left the hospital together, truly together for the first time in months, Clara's story entered a new phase, from miraculous survival to ongoing mission, from personal transformation to community healing. 5 years later, on a crisp December morning in 1978, 14-year-old Clara Martinez walked through the halls of Detroit Medical Center with the confident stride of someone who belonged there. Her weekly volunteer shift in the pediatric ward had become as regular as Sunday Mass, and the staff had long since stopped being amazed by her natural ability to comfort frightened children and anxious parents. In her hand, Clara carried the journal she had started keeping after that miraculous night under the bridge, a record of small miracles and answered prayers that had grown into dozens of filled notebooks. Each entry documented moments when hope appeared in impossible circumstances, when healing came from unexpected sources, when love proved stronger than despair. "Today I met Tommy Rodriguez, age 7, scheduled for heart surgery tomorrow," Clara wrote in her neat handwriting during a quiet moment in the hospital chapel. "He was so scared he wouldn't talk to anyone, not even his mama. But when I showed him Mr. Bear and told him about my night under the bridge, he started asking questions. I explained how sometimes scary things happen, but we're never truly alone. By the end of our visit, he was laughing and playing with the other kids. Mama Rosa always says that courage is contagious. I think maybe hope is too. The Martinez family had indeed found their way back to stability, but not through any conventional path. Miguel's recovery from alcoholism had been aided by what he described as visits from Maria Santos in his dreams, gentle conversations in which the deceased nurse helped him understand that his worth as a father wasn't determined by his failures, but by his willingness to keep trying. Rosa had returned to school, earning her GED and eventually becoming a certified nursing assistant, inspired by the woman who had saved her daughter's life. They still lived in the same neighborhood, but their small apartment had become a gathering place for families in crisis. Word had spread through Detroit's struggling communities that the Martinez family had experienced something extraordinary, and people began seeking them out, not for miracles exactly, but for the kind of hope that survives impossible circumstances. Clara's annual pilgrimage to the bridge where she'd been abandoned had become a neighborhood tradition. Each December 21st, she would place flowers at the spot where Maria Santos had first appeared to her, but she no longer went alone. Over the years, she'd been joined by other children she'd met through her volunteer work. Parents whose babies had survived critical surgeries, hospital staff who'd witnessed unexplained recoveries they attributed to Maria's continuing presence. This year's vigil was special because it marked the 10th anniversary of Maria Santos's memorial plaque at the hospital. The simple dedication had grown into something larger, a children's crisis fund that provided emergency assistance to families facing impossible choices. Clara had been instrumental in establishing the fund, using her story to inspire donations from people who understood that miracles sometimes came disguised as practical help. The lady taught me that miracles aren't always big, dramatic things. Clara told the assembled crowd at this year's bridge vigil. Sometimes they're as simple as a warm coat when you're cold, or a safe place to sleep when you're scared, or someone believing in you when you can't believe in yourself. Among those gathered at the bridge were faces from throughout Clara's journey. Dr. Morrison, now head of pediatrics, came every year with her own family, teaching her children about the power of faith to sustain hope in dark times. Detective Thompson, recently retired, brought his grandchildren to hear the story of how one miraculous night had changed so many lives. Father O'Brien, grayer but still serving Detroit's spiritual needs, offered prayers for all those who found themselves abandoned and afraid. But perhaps the most significant presence at this year's vigil was Maria Elena Santos, Maria's great-niece, who had traveled from Mexico to see the place where her family's legend had taken on new life. She was Clara's age, and the two girls had formed an immediate bond built on their shared connection to the nurse, whose compassion transcended death. "My great-aunt would be so proud," Maria Elena told Clara as they knelt together in the snow, where the miracle had occurred. She always said that love never dies, it just finds new ways to express itself. Clara nodded, understanding more deeply now what had happened to her that terrible night. Maria Santos hadn't simply appeared to save one abandoned child. She had initiated a cycle of healing that would continue as long as people remembered that divine love works through human hearts willing to serve others. The vigil concluded with Clara reading from her journal, not her own entries, but letters from children she'd helped over the years. Thank you notes from kids who'd survived surgeries, graduation announcements from teenagers who'd been close to giving up, wedding invitations from young adults who credited Clara's encouragement with helping them believe in better futures. "This is what the lady meant when she said miracles multiply," Clara told the crowd. "Every time we help someone else, every time we choose love over fear, every time we refuse to give up on each other, we're continuing the work she started." As the crowd began to disperse, Clara remained at the bridge with her parents, just as she had 5 years earlier in the hospital chapel. But now, their reunion was complete, their healing ongoing, their mission clear. They were no longer the broken family that had made desperate choices in desperate circumstances. They had become instruments of the same grace that had saved them, living proof that redemption was always possible. Clara pulled out her current journal and wrote the day's final entry. Year 5, Bridge Vigil complete. Every year, I understand better that the lady didn't just save my life that night. She saved my family, my community, and everyone who hears this story and decides to believe that miracles are real. Tomorrow, I start my sophomore year of high school. Sister Margaret says I have a gift for helping people, and she thinks I might want to consider nursing school when I graduate. I think Miss Maria would like that. I know I would. Closing the journal, Clara looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the December sky and whispered the prayer she'd been saying every night for 5 years. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for teaching me to save others. Help me never forget that love is always stronger than fear. In the distance, the lights of Detroit Medical Center glowed like a beacon of hope in the darkness, and Clara knew that somewhere within those walls, Maria Santos continued her work, watching over children who needed miracles and inspiring people like Clara to be the hands and hearts through which those miracles could unfold.